When I first saw the house, it felt like everything I'd ever dreamed of. The long driveway lined with oak trees, the quiet street that smelled faintly of fresh-cut grass, and the gentle hum of suburban calm. It all felt right. It wasn't just a house. It was the promise of peace after years of city chaos. Moving here was supposed to be a fresh start, a place where I could finally breathe. The first few days were blissful. Every morning I had to step out with a coffee mug and watch the sun rise over the neatly trimmed lawns. Neighbors waved, kids rode their bikes, and the entire community seemed to move in a rhythm of quiet harmony. The kind of life people post about, where fences gleam white and mailboxes stand straight, like symbols of order and pride. But beneath that calm surface, something darker hid. It began subtly. Small notices, friendly warnings, and polite reminders. The first letter came 3 days after I unpacked. A notice about trash bins not being appropriately positioned. The wording was formal, almost sterile, but the tone carried authority, as if the sender enjoyed reminding others who was in charge. The second letter arrived only a week later. This time, it was about the color of my door. It didn't match the approved neighborhood palette. I'd painted it a soft blue, thinking it gave the house a cheerful charm. But apparently, charm wasn't part of the HOA's vision. The letter demanded immediate repainting, or face a fine. At first, I brushed it off. Rules were rules, I thought. Every neighborhood had them. But as the weeks passed, the letters multiplied. A warning about my mailbox height. Another about my small flower bed, which did not comply with the uniform landscaping standard. Every little thing I touched seemed to be wrong. Curious, I asked a few neighbors about the letters. Some avoided the question. Others shrugged and whispered the same name, Marilyn Shaw, the HOA president. They said it with a mixture of fear and exhaustion, as if even mentioning her might summon another violation notice. Marilyn was known for her control. She lived at the end of the street in a spotless white colonial with perfect hedges trimmed to geometric precision. Her yard looked more like a display piece than a home. Not a leaf out of place, not a pebble unaligned. Rumor had it, she'd fined her own cousin for leaving Christmas decorations up a day too long. Soon her presence became impossible to ignore. Every time I drove past, I felt her eyes following me from behind those curtained windows. When I replaced my old mailbox, I found a new notice the next morning. When I tried planting a few fruit trees, she cited community uniformity and issued another fine. It stopped feeling like home. It felt like surveillance. Each evening, I'd find myself walking around the house wondering what she might find next. A patch of uncut grass? A misplaced watering can? It was as though my every movement was being measured against a list of invisible rules. Rules written not for fairness, but for control. Neighbors began to whisper that Marilyn had driven out others before me. A young couple once tried repainting their shutters. Within months, they'd sold the house. Another family installed solar panels. They were fined into silence. Every act of individuality was crushed beneath her authority. And yet, the HOA board worshipped her. She was meticulous, they said, organized. The community looked perfect under her leadership, and that was all that mattered. But I couldn't ignore the growing frustration. What was once a sanctuary was turning into a battleground. Every letter from her felt like a personal strike, a reminder that this wasn't my home. It was hers. She didn't need to live in my house to control it. Her rules did that for her. The breaking point came when she cited me for unauthorized structural changes. I had installed a small wooden pergola in my backyard, a quiet spot to relax, invisible from the street. Yet somehow she knew. The fine was steep. The tone of her letter wasn't just formal anymore, it was threatening. She hinted that continued non-compliance could lead to legal action. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the letter. I felt anger, but also something deeper, curiosity. How did she know? How could she possibly track everything happening in private yards across the neighborhood? That question lit a spark in me. I decided to start keeping records of every notice, every letter, every interaction. If she wanted a game of rules, I'd play by them. But this time, I'd document everything, because something about her control didn't feel lawful. It felt personal. And when I started digging into the HOA's paperwork, the board structure, and old property records, I began to see small cracks in the perfect picture she painted. Irregularities, missing financial entries, discrepancies that didn't match the neighborhood's official statements. The woman who prided herself on control might have built her authority on lies. And if that were true, then I wasn't just fighting for my home anymore. I was fighting to expose her. As I stared out the window at her pristine house glowing under the streetlight, I made a silent vow. This war wasn't over. The HOA had rules, but I had truth. And soon everyone would know who Marilyn Shaw really was. The morning after I made my decision, the neighborhood felt different. The same trimmed lawns, the same white fences, the same spotless sidewalks. Yet there was something uneasy beneath the surface. Once you start looking for control, you see it everywhere. Every hedge trimmed to the same height, every mailbox spaced at exact intervals, every front porch painted in identical tones of beige, gray, and white. It wasn't beauty, it was obedience. I began my quiet investigation with the HOA's public records. According to community bylaws, homeowners had the right to review meeting notes, budget reports, and spending summaries. So I requested access under the HOA's own transparency clause, something I doubted anyone had done in years. At first, I received polite delays. The board claimed they were compiling documents, then said they were verifying versions. But weeks passed, and I still had nothing. It was as if they were stalling, waiting for me to give up. But I didn't. In the meantime, I started paying attention to how Marilyn operated. Every week, like clockwork, she made her rounds, clipboard in hand, walking slowly along the sidewalks as if inspecting soldiers in formation. Sometimes she stopped in front of a house and wrote something down. Other times, she took photos. The residents would peek from behind curtains, nervous to be noticed. Fear ruled this place. The few neighbors I tried to talk to were careful with their words. One older man whispered that Marilyn had eyes everywhere. Another family hinted that she had relatives on the HOA board, which explained why no one dared to question her. But even whispers carried risk. In this neighborhood, words could cost you a fine. Eventually, I received a small envelope from the HOA office. Inside was a stack of photocopied pages, the last 2 years of financial summaries. They were clean. Almost too clean. Every expense looked routine: landscaping, maintenance, office costs, legal fees. But one detail caught my eye: the line for consulting services. It appeared in every quarter's report, with vague notes and round figures. The totals didn't match any receipts or itemized records. I started mapping patterns. Every time a new consulting expense appeared, a new round of homeowner fines followed shortly after. The money collected from those fines matched almost perfectly the sums paid out under that consulting line. It was as if fines weren't just punishment. They were funding something. Curiosity turned into obsession. I began attending HOA meetings, not to speak, but to watch. Marilyn always sat at the head of the long oak table, her binder full of documents, her voice calm and rehearsed. Around her, the other board members nodded along, rarely questioning anything. She spoke with the certainty of someone who believed she owned every word spoken in that room. But I noticed something else. Tension. A younger member, a man named Derek, seemed uneasy. He shuffled papers, hesitated when signing off on new budgets. His eyes met mine once during a vote, and for a split second, I saw guilt. That was when I knew I wasn't imagining things. Outside of meetings, Marilyn maintained her spotless reputation. She attended every event, hosted garden parties, and reminded everyone how her dedication kept property values high. She wore her title like a crown, but the more perfect she appeared, the more I realized perfection was her armor. People like her needed control, and control always came with something to hide. To dig deeper, I filed another request, this time for vendor contracts. According to HOA law, homeowners could review any document involving neighborhood expenditures. The response I received was sharp. This information is confidential. Further inquiries may be considered harassment. That word, harassment, was her shield. She used it to silence questions, but by labeling transparency as an attack, she exposed something she didn't mean to. If everything was legitimate, why fear scrutiny? I knew I needed evidence, something undeniable. So I began keeping a detailed log of every fine, every letter, every expense mentioned in meetings. I compared them against old copies of HOA newsletters, and that's when the story started to unfold. 5 years ago, before Marilyn became president, the HOA operated with simple budgets and clear records. No consulting fees, no mysterious transactions. Then, after her election, a wave of community improvements began. Projects with inflated costs and no visible results. Sidewalk repairs that never happened. Lighting upgrades that no one remembered seeing. Yet the money had vanished. The perfection of the neighborhood was built on fear, but its finances were built on fiction. The more I pieced together, the more isolated I felt. Marilyn's presence loomed over everything. My mailbox now received new violations almost weekly. Uncut grass, improper garden edging, even a decorative item on the porch that did not reflect community uniformity. It was clear she knew I was watching her, and she was watching me back. Late one evening, I caught a glimpse of her white SUV idling near my driveway. She sat inside, lights off, engine running, her silhouette barely visible. When I stepped outside, she drove away slowly, as if to remind me that she saw everything. The next morning, a letter appeared taped to my door, not mailed, but hand-delivered. It stated that continued hostility toward the association could result in legal proceedings and potential liens against my property. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just about fines or paperwork anymore. Marilyn wasn't protecting the community. She was protecting herself. And she was willing to destroy anyone who got close to her secret. But she underestimated me. I wasn't backing down. I had already gathered enough to suspect fraud. And if I could link her consulting payments to personal gain, I could bring her down legally. As I organized my notes, I saw a pattern forming. A trail that pointed toward one name, one company listed repeatedly in the records. A company that didn't exist online, had no business registration, and no physical address. It was time to find out who was behind it. And if I was right, the woman who ruled this neighborhood with an iron fist was funding her power with the very money she stole from those she controlled. I wasn't living under her rule anymore. I was building her downfall. The deeper I went, the more the neighborhood began to feel like a stage. Every lawn, every polished car, every smiling wave rehearsed to hide what lurked behind it. Marilyn's version of perfection wasn't built on harmony. It was built on silence. Everyone here was playing a part, terrified of what might happen if they stepped out of line. But I had already stepped out, and there was no going back. The name I found buried in the HOA's financial summaries kept echoing in my mind. Greenpoint Consulting. It appeared across multiple years, always linked to vague notes like community development, policy review, or landscape assessment. Yet, when I searched online, there was nothing. No website, no business registration, no trace of it in state databases. It was as if the company existed only on paper. I drove to the address listed in the HOA files, a small office suite on the outskirts of town. But when I arrived, the building was empty. Dust-covered windows, a faded for lease sign, and no trace of any tenant named Greenpoint. The place hadn't been used in years. That was the moment I realized I wasn't chasing bad bookkeeping. I was chasing a ghost company. The next HOA meeting only confirmed my suspicion. Marilyn presented a glowing report about strategic community investments. She spoke confidently, her words polished, her tone calm. The board nodded without question, signing off on yet another round of consulting fees. I sat quietly in the back, taking notes, feeling a mix of disbelief and fury. When the meeting ended, I lingered in the hallway. Derek, the uneasy board member, exited last. I didn't speak. I simply watched him. His eyes flickered toward Marilyn, then down to the floor. He looked trapped, like someone who wanted to say something but couldn't. That glance told me everything. Someone else knew the truth. Over the next week, I doubled down on research. I pulled public business filings from the county clerk's office. It took hours of sifting through forms, but finally I found a clue: a business registration for Greenpoint Consulting LLC, dated 3 years ago. Listed under the filing agent was a name I recognized immediately: Robert Shaw, Marilyn's husband. It all began to make sense. Marilyn wasn't paying a real consulting firm. She was funneling HOA money through a shell company created in her husband's name. The fines, the excessive control, the obsession with rules, they were tools to generate cash. Every violation, every petty citation was fuel for her system. She wasn't just enforcing order, she was profiting from it. Now I had proof, but not enough to make it public. If I confronted her directly, she would bury me in legal threats. If I went to the board, her loyal members would cover for her. I needed to build an airtight case, one she couldn't twist or deny. So I began collecting every record I could find. Old HOA newsletters, financial statements, meeting minutes. I compared signatures, cross-referenced dates, and took photos of every document. Slowly, a timeline formed. The pattern was clear. Each year, as the number of homeowner fines increased, so did Greenpoint's payments. Marilyn's reign of control wasn't about keeping lawns perfect. It was about keeping money flowing. But exposing her wouldn't be easy. She had built layers of protection: legal jargon, loyal board members, and neighbors too afraid to speak. To win, I needed someone inside. Fate intervened one evening. As I walked home from work, I saw Derek standing outside his house, nervously glancing around. When our eyes met, he hesitated, then gave the smallest nod, motioning me toward his driveway. I didn't need words. His expression said enough. He knew. Over the next few days, he began slipping information quietly. Old emails, draft budgets, and board memos, small pieces, but each one painted a clearer picture. He told me that Marilyn controlled everything: what documents were shared, which expenses were justified, and even who could access records. Anyone who questioned her found violations on their doorstep. Some resigned. Others sold their homes and left. Derek had tried to speak up once, he said. A week later, he received 6 violation notices in one day. The message was clear: silence or punishment. Still, he passed me what he could. One document in particular stood out: a reimbursement request, hand-signed by Marilyn, approving payment to Greenpoint for policy development. Now I had undeniable evidence that she had personally approved payments to her husband's company. But the more I uncovered, the more dangerous things became. One night I returned home to find tire tracks across my lawn: deep, fresh, deliberate. Another morning, my trash bin had been overturned and scattered across the street. It wasn't random. It was a warning. Then came the letter. Unlike the formal notices before, this one was typed in bold print and slipped directly under my door. It wasn't signed, but the tone was unmistakable. It warned me that continued interference in HOA operations would lead to legal action and serious consequences. Marilyn knew I was closing in. Still, I couldn't stop. I filed an anonymous complaint with the county auditor's office, attaching the evidence I'd gathered: financial records, screenshots, and her signature on the reimbursement forms. If the HOA was mishandling funds, the county could launch an audit. Days turned into weeks. The neighborhood remained unnervingly calm, but I could feel the storm brewing. Marilyn's eyes followed me whenever I passed her house. Her SUV appeared behind me on late-night drives. Even her tone at meetings shifted, less polished, more strained. Then, one morning, I found an envelope in my mailbox, this time not from the HOA but from the county. Inside was a formal notice confirming receipt of my complaint and notifying the HOA of an impending financial review. Marilyn's empire was about to face its first real test. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the rooftops, the neighborhood felt heavier. Lights flickered on one by one, but behind every curtain, I sensed whispers beginning. People knew something was coming. The perfection they had lived under for years was about to crack wide open, and for the first time since moving here, I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like the one holding the match, and Marilyn S.'s carefully constructed kingdom was soaked in gasoline. When the official audit notice was delivered to every household, the neighborhood froze. For years, residents had lived under Marilyn's rules, conditioned to obey without question. But now, with an external authority stepping in, the silence she'd maintained began to crack. Whispered conversations spread from porch to porch. Lawns still gleamed, but behind closed doors, people were talking. Marilyn's usual morning patrol stopped abruptly. Her once daily walks, clipboard in hand, gaze sharp, were replaced by drawn curtains, and the sight of her car parked motionless in her driveway. For a woman who thrived on control, the loss of it must have been unbearable. Within a week, county officials arrived. They were polite but firm. Auditors in dark suits carrying clipboards and laptops, combing through documents inside the HOA's small office. Neighbors watched from a distance, curiosity mixing with disbelief. For the first time, Marilyn wasn't the one giving orders. I kept my distance too, quietly observing. I didn't want to risk exposure just yet. Though I had submitted my complaint anonymously, Marilyn wasn't stupid. She had likely already guessed who set this in motion. Inside that office, years of her careful image were being dissected line by line. Each expense, each payment, each signed approval was now evidence. The auditors requested receipts, invoices, and correspondence. And as the days went on, they began asking questions that spread unease through the board. The first signs of panic came quickly. Derek told me that during a closed-door meeting, Marilyn had lost her composure for the first time. Her voice, once measured and calm, broke into shouting. She accused board members of misplacing documents and failing to follow protocol. Those who had once nodded obediently now sat silent, afraid to share her blame. Then came the notices. Homeowners received letters announcing a temporary freeze on HOA fines and collections until the audit concludes. To the residents, it was a relief. To Marilyn, it was the first public humiliation. Her control, once absolute, was slipping through her fingers. I could feel the tension building around me. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact now approached cautiously, asking questions they'd never dared before. Do you think something's wrong? Is it true about the money? The same people who once feared her began to suspect the truth, that their peace had been paid for with deceit. As the audit continued, small leaks began to surface. One neighbor shared that the auditors had discovered duplicate invoices, payments made twice to the same vendor with no documentation of service. Another said the auditors questioned why so many consulting fees went to the same company. Word spread quickly. Greenpoint Consulting had no verifiable operations. The illusion was collapsing. Marilyn tried to fight back. She sent community-wide emails insisting the audit was routine, claiming it was all part of standard transparency. But the language in her messages carried a defensive edge. Long explanations, bolded reassurances, promises that everything was completely compliant. Her tone, once commanding, had turned desperate. Her home, once a symbol of order, began to show subtle signs of strain. Overgrown hedges, uncollected mail, fewer lights on at night. It was as though the perfection she forced on others had finally abandoned her. Then, one afternoon, I saw 2 county vehicles parked in front of her house. The officials stayed for hours. By evening, word spread that they had removed several boxes of documents. Whatever they found inside that house wasn't part of the official HOA archive. For the next few days, Marilyn vanished from sight. Her car was gone, her porch empty. The neighborhood, so long under her watchful eye, felt strangely free. Children played louder. Neighbors lingered outside longer. It was as if the air itself had lightened. But freedom came with fear. Everyone knew something big was coming, a reckoning. The county's findings were released 3 weeks later. The report, quietly distributed to homeowners, confirmed what I had suspected all along. Greenpoint Consulting was a shell company registered under Robert Shaw, Marilyn's husband. Over $90,000 had been funneled through it over 3 years under false expense claims. Most of that money came directly from homeowner fines. The report didn't stop there. It detailed multiple violations: misuse of HOA funds, conflict of interest, falsified invoices, and unauthorized expenditures. It was a blueprint of greed dressed as order. The shock rippled through the community. Residents who once defended Marilyn now avoided her name. The board called an emergency meeting, this time led by the vice president. Derek, though visibly shaken, finally spoke up. The board unanimously voted to suspend Marilyn pending further investigation. That night, her house sat in silence. No lights, no movement. The woman who once ruled every mailbox and flower bed was now a ghost in her own neighborhood. But for me, victory came with a strange emptiness. I had set this in motion. I had wanted justice, yet watching the slow unraveling of her empire didn't bring joy. Only the heavy realization of how much damage she'd done. Her tyranny had shaped this place. Fear had become habit. Even now, people looked over their shoulders before speaking freely. It would take time for the neighborhood to remember what life without her control felt like. Still, I knew it wasn't over. The audit was only the beginning. Financial misconduct could lead to civil penalties, maybe even criminal charges. And if she truly believed she was untouchable, she might fight back harder than ever. The next morning, I received a letter, not from the HOA, but hand-delivered again. The handwriting was familiar, sharp, precise. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No header, no signature, just one line. "You think you've won, but you don't know what I've kept hidden." My heart sank. This wasn't over. If she still had secrets, something she could use against me or the HOA, then her silence wasn't surrender. It was preparation, and I had no idea what was coming next. The letter sat on my kitchen table for hours, the single sentence burning itself into my mind. "You think you've won, but you don't know what I've kept hidden." It wasn't a threat in the usual sense, not loud or direct. It was quieter, colder, more deliberate. Marilyn wasn't lashing out, she was warning me. I had seen her power crumble. Her empire of fear was collapsing under the weight of exposure, yet this note suggested she wasn't finished. There was still something she held, something that could shift the balance again. And if I had learned anything about her by now, it was that Marilyn never played fair. The neighborhood had begun to change. For the first time, residents spoke freely in the streets, unafraid of who might be watching. Driveways once patrolled for non-compliance now displayed welcome mats and planters in mismatched colors. The illusion of order had broken, replaced by small acts of rebellion. But beneath the cautious optimism, there lingered unease, because Marilyn was still here. Though suspended from her position, she hadn't left. Her house remained dark most nights, but occasionally I'd see lights flicker inside, a faint glow from her office window long after midnight. She wasn't rebuilding her image. She was preparing something. I decided to find out what. It began with a hunch. During the audit, the county had seized several boxes from her house, yet the final report mentioned only documents related to finances. Nothing personal, nothing from her home office. If Marilyn's note hinted at something hidden, it was likely something she kept off the books entirely, files that never made it into official records. To trace it, I needed access to what remained in the HOA office. Derek agreed to help. After the audit, he had been appointed interim president, tasked with restoring transparency. He wasn't eager to reopen old wounds, but he understood the risk of leaving anything undiscovered. If Marilyn still had leverage, she could destroy what little trust the neighborhood had regained. When we entered the office one evening, the air felt heavy, the stale scent of old paper and fear lingering like a memory. The filing cabinets had been meticulously organized, each drawer labeled by year. Marilyn's influence was visible even in her absence. For hours, we combed through boxes, scanning invoices, receipts, and correspondence. Most of it had already been reviewed, but deep in the back, we found something different. A thin binder marked Board Confidential. Inside were handwritten notes, photocopied letters, and printed screenshots. But these weren't financial documents. They were personal, records of homeowners, names, addresses, violation histories, and even notes about their behavior. One entry read, "Hostile attitude during meeting, monitor future compliance." Another, "Late dues last spring, possible pressure point." Marilyn hadn't just enforced rules. She had built profiles. She tracked habits, weaknesses, and private disputes. It was surveillance disguised as administration. But there was more. Tucked in the back was a flash drive taped inside the binder's cover. I pocketed it carefully, unsure what it contained. At home, I hesitated before opening it. My laptop's screen glowed against the dark, reflecting my unease. When I clicked the first file, a folder expanded into dozens of subfolders, each labeled with the name of a resident. Inside were photographs, photos of backyards, porches, cars, even through windows, all time-stamped. Marilyn hadn't just monitored compliance, she had invaded privacy. Every supposed violation had been documented through her own surveillance. Some images were taken at night, others from angles suggesting she'd entered private property. My stomach turned. This was worse than corruption. This was obsession. Then I found something unexpected, a folder with my name. I opened it, heart pounding. Inside were photos of my backyard pergola, my mailbox, even my driveway at night. But one image froze me completely. It was taken inside my yard, close enough to capture the faint outline of me through my kitchen window. She had been on my property. Scrolling further, I found copies of emails, messages sent to the board accusing me of hostile intent and interference with HOA operations. Attached were fabricated screenshots, altered to make it appear as though I had threatened legal action months before the audit. She had tried to build a case against me before I ever exposed her. This was her hidden weapon, leverage against anyone who challenged her. If she couldn't control through fines, she would control through fear. But what unsettled me most was a final folder labeled Private. Inside, I found correspondence between Marilyn and someone with the initials RS, her husband, Robert. The emails discussed moving money between accounts, creating backup files, and ensuring the originals stay off-site. One line stood out, "If anyone connects the dots, we'll bury them in complaints and legal action. Keep the documents safe, and they're our insurance." Insurance. That word stuck with me. It meant there were still documents out there. Originals, untouched by the audit. If those files were discovered, they might contain more than financial fraud. They might reveal how deep her manipulation ran. The next day, I contacted the county auditor's office again, forwarding the evidence anonymously. I included the photos, emails, and notes. If they reopened the case, they could subpoena digital records and trace where the files had been stored. But by then, Marilyn must have realized I had her flash drive. That evening, as I pulled into my driveway, I noticed something off. My mailbox door hung open, a screw missing. Inside was a single envelope, blank except for one printed photo. It was me, sitting at my desk, looking at my laptop, taken from outside my window. She was watching again. I stepped inside and locked every door. The realization hit me. Marilyn wasn't T-finished because her greatest weapon wasn't T-money or titles. It was intimidation. Even stripped of power, she could still make people afraid. But this time, fear wouldn't work. I had her evidence. And I was no longer the newcomer unsure of the rules. I understood now that the HOA's real threat had never been about fines or violations. It had been about control, and she had just lost hers. As I backed up the files and prepared copies for investigators, one thought lingered in my mind. If Marilyn had gone this far to keep secrets, what else was buried beneath this perfect neighborhood? The truth had cracked her empire. Now I was about to shatter it completely. The final act of Marilyn Shaw's reign began not with a confrontation, but with silence. The kind of heavy, charged silence that descends before a storm. Her house remained dark, her mailbox untouched, her once perfect lawn beginning to yellow at the edges. The woman who once ruled every inch of this neighborhood now hid behind her own walls, surrounded by the remnants of power she could no longer wield. But silence doesn't mean surrender. I knew she was still moving in the shadows, clinging to the last threads of her influence. The photo she left in my mailbox proved it. She still believed fear could undo me. What she didn't realize was that her tactics, once effective, had lost their hold. The neighborhood wasn't the same anymore. People were no longer whispering. They were talking, openly, loudly. Her silence had given others courage. When the county reopened the investigation, the first sign came quietly. An unmarked envelope delivered to every homeowner. It announced a Phase 2 audit following newly obtained digital evidence. The notice cited potential privacy violations and unauthorized surveillance. That last word, surveillance, sent ripples through the community. The residents finally understood what I had come to learn. Marilyn hadn't been protecting them. She had been watching them. Within days, investigators returned. This time, they weren't just collecting paperwork. They carried forensic equipment, external drives, scanners, laptops. They combed through every file, every computer, every camera linked to HOA business. It didn't take long for them to trace the surveillance photos back to a storage drive registered under Robert Shaw's name, hosted in a remote data center 2 towns over. The files contained hundreds of images, timestamps, locations, even license plate numbers. It was a digital map of control, one that turned every home into a monitored zone. Her system wasn't just invasive, it was illegal. The county's findings were swift and severe. A formal report accused Marilyn and her husband of embezzlement, evidence tampering, and unlawful surveillance of private property. The HOA board, desperate to distance itself, voted unanimously to remove her permanently. Her name was struck from every document, her title erased from the community she once commanded. But Marilyn didn't go quietly. When the story broke, local news crews arrived, cameras lining the entrance to our once quiet street. Neighbors gathered behind fences, watching as officers escorted boxes of evidence from her home. Marilyn appeared only once, stepping out of her front door, expression pale but defiant, eyes scanning the crowd as though daring someone to look away. Even in disgrace, she carried herself like a monarch stripped of her throne. But this time, no one bowed. Over the following weeks, her house grew emptier. Curtains came down. Furniture disappeared piece by piece. Eventually, a for sale sign appeared on her pristine lawn, a quiet symbol that the queen had fallen. The neighborhood began to breathe again. Without her watchful eyes, life returned in small, beautiful imperfections. Lawns grew uneven, driveways bore chalk drawings, and porches displayed mismatched decorations. What had once been a street of replicas now felt alive. At the next HOA meeting, Derek sat at the head of the table, not with authority, but with humility. The board opened the floor to homeowners, encouraging them to speak freely for the first time in years. People laughed, argued, debated. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. I sat in the back listening. No one mentioned my name, but their glances carried quiet gratitude. The fear that once bound them had turned into solidarity. They had seen what unchecked power could do, and they weren't about to let it happen again. Still, even in victory, I couldn't shake the weight of everything uncovered. Marilyn hadn't built her empire alone. The system had enabled her, a structure that rewarded control and punished individuality. She had merely taken it to its logical extreme. In the weeks that followed, I decided to stay. Part of me had considered leaving, selling the house, escaping the memories of constant battles and letters taped to my door. But now, this place meant something more. It wasn't just a house. It was proof that standing up mattered, even when the odds felt impossible. One evening, as the sun dipped low, I walked past Marilyn's house. It stood silent, stripped of its authority, its hedges overgrown, the once perfect symmetry now fractured by neglect. For the first time, it looked like any other home, ordinary, flawed, human. As I turned to leave, I noticed something faint in the front yard. Half buried beneath the grass was a small rusted sign, one I'd never seen before. I knelt and brushed away the dirt. The lettering was faded, but I could still make out the words, Shaw Community Development Project, founded 2009. It was a reminder that Marilyn hadn't just ruled this place, she had built it. Her vision of perfection had shaped every corner, every rule, every fear. Even in ruin, her fingerprints lingered. But so did mine. Because now, where her name once symbolized control, the residents saw something different. Resilience. They had learned to question, to challenge, to live without fear of being fined for a misplaced flower pot. And in the quiet that followed, I realized something else. Marilyn's story wasn't just about corruption or revenge. It was about the illusion of control, how power, once taken for granted, can twist even the best intentions into something poisonous. Weeks later, a moving truck arrived at her house. She didn't return. The vehicle loaded the last of her belongings and drove away under a gray morning sky. No one waved. No one watched for long. The neighborhood simply carried on. In time, grass grew over the marks her presence left behind. New families moved in, laughter replaced whispers, and though her shadow once loomed over every porch and pathway, it slowly faded, leaving behind not fear, but freedom. Standing at my doorway, I took one last look at the quiet street bathed in sunlight. The place that had once been a battleground now felt like home again. And somewhere beyond that horizon, Marilyn Shaw, the self-proclaimed queen of perfection, was left to face the one thing she could never control: the truth.